You wake up one morning and everything feels off. Not dramatically. Nothing has exploded. No one has died. But there's a subtle wrongness in the air. The clothes you pick feel like a costume. The words you say over breakfast sound rehearsed. You smile out of habit, not emotion. And as you walk through the motions of your day, a quiet question drips like a leaky faucet in the back of your mind. Whose life am I living? Not in a poetic, existential sense. Literally, whose voice told you to want that career? Who taught you what success looks like? Why do you seek validation from people you don't even respect? And who benefits from your constant performance of competence, happiness, confidence? You start to realize something deeply unsettling. There's a stranger living in your head, and it speaks in your voice. This stranger is not your true self. It's not your soul, your intuition, or even your survival instinct. It's something far more insidious, your ego, and it's been in control for longer than you think. Here's the paradox. The ego presents itself as you, as your protector, your identity, your guide through life. It tells you who you are, what you deserve, and how the world should treat you. It rewards you for achievements. It punishes you for vulnerability. It urges you to appear strong when you're breaking inside. It whispers that you are what others think of you, and if you lose their approval, you lose everything. But what if the ego is not a guide, but a hijacker? What if the very thing you've trusted to navigate your life is the force that has quietly imprisoned you, trapping you in endless cycles of comparison, defensiveness, and the fear of not being enough? The ego is not evil in the traditional sense. It's clever, subtle. It doesn't scream. It seduces. It convinces you that love must be earned, that worth is conditional, and that failure is fatal. It builds an identity not to express who you are, but to protect you from ever being seen. And that's the core tragedy. The ego's greatest fear is your authenticity, because authenticity threatens the fragile structure it's built. It can't survive your softness, your uncertainty, your self-honesty. So it weaponizes pride. It glorifies independence while starving your need for connection. It turns healing into weakness and stillness into laziness. Ever notice how you talk to yourself when you mess up? That voice that says, "You're such an idiot," or "They're all judging you," or "You have to prove them wrong." That voice isn't your soul. It's your ego trying to survive by keeping you performing, pretending, posturing. And here's the most sinister part. The ego doesn't want peace. It wants survival. And in its mind, survival depends on control, superiority, and illusion of certainty. It doesn't care if you're miserable, as long as you appear successful. It doesn't care if you're lonely, as long as you seem admired. It doesn't care if you're empty, as long as the image stays full. So you build a life around that image. You choose partners that make you look good. You chase goals that others admire. You avoid anything that might reveal your vulnerability. Because to the ego, vulnerability is exposure, and exposure is death. But what if that's a lie? What if everything you thought would protect you has only been numbing you? What if the ego isn't saving your life, but stealing it? And here lies the terrifying question no one wants to ask. Who would you be without the ego? Not just in theory, but in practice. If you strip away the need to impress, to dominate, to prove, what remains? Silence? Stillness? Shame? Or maybe something real? Something ancient and soft and quietly powerful? The journey into that question is not easy, because to confront the ego is to confront everything you were told you had to be. It is a psychological exorcism, an inner death, but every death carries the possibility of rebirth. And so, the real question becomes, are you ready to meet the part of yourself that's been buried beneath the performance? To understand how the ego hijacked your life, you must first realize it didn't start with you. You weren't born with it. Not the way you know it now. You came into the world whole, undivided, hungry to feel, to explore, to connect. But something happened. Slowly, piece by piece, you were taught that your raw self was unacceptable. Too much, too loud, too sensitive, too strange. So you did what all children do when love becomes conditional. You adapted. You crafted a mask, a version of yourself that would be praised, accepted, loved. That mask became your identity. You forgot it was a performance. And in that forgetting, the ego was born. Carl Jung called this the persona, the socially constructed self, designed not to express your essence but to protect it. He warned that identifying with the persona is the beginning of inner death, because the more you cling to the image, the more your true self becomes a stranger. But here's the psychological twist. The persona becomes so convincing that even you believe it. You forget the child who laughed too loud, cried too easily, asked questions no one could answer. You forget the part of you that wasn't performing, just being, and in that forgetting, the ego takes the throne. This is where Friedrich Nietzsche's insight pierces deeper. He did not speak of the ego in clinical terms. He spoke of the will to power, the force that drives man to dominate, to assert identity, to rise above perceived weakness. To Nietzsche, the ego is the armor we wear to escape the terror of insignificance. We build it not from truth, but from reaction, reacting to shame, to abandonment, to the fear of non-existence. But what happens when your life becomes a reaction? You no longer move from vision. You move from defense. Every achievement is a shield. Every opinion is a sword. You build walls instead of bridges, because deep down the ego knows it is fragile, and fragility masked as strength becomes aggression. Arthur Schopenhauer saw ego as a distortion of the will to life. To him, all suffering stems from desire, and the ego is nothing but desire in disguise. It pretends to want love, but it truly craves superiority. It pretends to seek truth, but only accepts truths that confirm its narrative. It pretends to fear failure, but actually fears irrelevance. So how does the ego maintain its grip? Through a simple, brilliant trick. It convinces you that it is necessary. It tells you, if you let go of me, you'll be nothing. If you're vulnerable, they'll hurt you. If you stop performing, they'll stop loving you. And because those fears mirror childhood wounds, you obey. But there's a deeper mechanism at play. The war between the conscious and unconscious mind. Gabor Mate has explored this in his work on trauma and addiction. He shows how we often act from unconscious pain, while the ego constructs a conscious story to explain our behavior. We don't see the real driver, we see the narrative. We think we're chasing goals. In truth, we're avoiding wounds. The ego thrives in that blindness. It splits you into two selves. The public self, who appears competent, charming, ambitious, and the private self, who is anxious, lonely, overwhelmed by shame. The ego then forces these two into silent war. You keep polishing the mask while secretly hating the face underneath, and society rewards this dissonance. Social media, corporate culture, even modern relationships, they often celebrate the persona, not the person. The better your mask, the more you're applauded. This is not an accident. It's a design. Jean-Paul Sartre believed that modern life alienates the individual from authenticity. He argued that we live in bad faith, pretending to be what others expect, betraying our own freedom. The ego is the enforcer of that bad faith. It says, don't rock the boat. Don't ask hard questions. Don't show your soul. Just play the role. But there is a price for that obedience, and it's higher than you think. Every time you suppress a truth to maintain your image, the ego grows stronger, and the soul grows quieter, until one day, you look in the mirror and see nothing behind your eyes. Just a performer, waiting for the next cue. Just a voice, echoing everyone else's expectations. And still the ego whispers, this is safety. But what if it isn't? What if the real danger isn't being seen, but being invisible behind the mask? What if you've been sacrificing your selfhood to maintain an identity that was never yours to begin with? The ego is not just a psychological structure. It's a philosophical prison, one built from fear, maintained by illusion, and enforced by the stories you repeat every day. And those stories are not random. They are inherited from culture, from family, from systems that benefit from your conformity. Because a person in ego is predictable, controllable, a cog in a machine of endless consumption, comparison, competition. But a person who awakens to their true self, they're dangerous. They're free. But freedom has a cost, and the ego will do everything to convince you that the cost is too high. You may not hear it. You may not even feel it, but it's there always, a quiet tightening in your chest when someone challenges you. That flash of jealousy when someone else shines. The compulsion to post, to prove, to perform. The panic you feel not when you're alone, but when you're unseen. These are not random emotional glitches. They are symptoms of the ego's rule. They're the residue of a life lived inside an invisible cage, the one built by your need to be someone in the eyes of others. You think you're making choices, but most of your choices are reactions, scripts written long ago by someone else's fears. You think you're growing, but much of that growth is performance. Another mask labeled self-improvement, designed to make your persona more palatable, more impressive, more monetizable. And perhaps most tragically, you think you're connected. But the ego is the great divider because it doesn't seek connection. It seeks comparison. And comparison is the death of intimacy. You can't be truly present with others when you're silently measuring your value against theirs. You can't listen when your mind is calculating how to appear wise. You can't love freely when love is a transaction between egos, each demanding to be the more powerful one. And yet, this ego-based dynamic is a default mode of most modern relationships. Friendships where vulnerability is feared. Romances where dominance is disguised as passion. Conversations where no one is really listening, just waiting for their turn to speak. The ego turns every interaction into a subtle battlefield. And in this war, the goal isn't truth, it's control. But the damage isn't just personal, it's cultural. We build entire societies on the scaffolding of the ego. We reward performance over presence. We glorify confidence over humility. We idolize self-branding over self-awareness. Social media is the ego's dream come true, a place where image can replace identity entirely, a place where you don't need to feel whole. You just need to appear curated, where depth is replaced with aesthetics, where the more you share, the less you're known. And so we scroll, we post, we judge, and all the while, the ego tightens its grip because it thrives in a loop of craving and validation. The brain's reward system becomes complicit. Neuroscience shows how dopamine spikes not from meaning, but from attention. You get a like, a comment, a new follower, and your brain lights up, not because your soul was nourished, but because your ego was fed. And slowly, the boundary between you and the mask disappears. You become what you perform. But there's a deeper consequence still, one more haunting. You stop dreaming your own dreams. Instead, you inherit the dream society sells you. The dream of success, the dream of fame, the dream of being envied, adored, imitated. You set goals that aren't yours. You chase lives that don't fit you. You follow paths that were never meant for your feet. And then you wonder why you feel so lost, even when you've made it. This is the ultimate betrayal of the ego. It doesn't just steal your present. It rewrites your future. By keeping you chasing, comparing, proving, it ensures you never stop long enough to ask, do I even want this? And if you do stop, the ego panics. It floods you with fear, because stillness threatens illusion. Reflection threatens a performance. The quiet voice within, the one you buried long ago, might wake up, and that voice doesn't care about your reputation. It doesn't care how many people clap when you enter the room. It doesn't care how perfect your life looks from the outside. It only asks, are you living in truth, or are you living in armor? But by the time most people hear that question, the damage has already been done. They've curated their identity so carefully, so convincingly, that even suggestion of change feels like death. This is not poetic exaggeration. To the ego, change is death, because the ego is the accumulation of everything that does not want to change. It clings to roles, to narratives, to grudges. It prefers suffering over surrender. It would rather be certain and miserable than vulnerable and free. And so we stay locked in roles that drain us, relationships that numb us, environments that poison us, all because the ego has convinced us that what's familiar is safe. But safety is not the same as truth. And here's the hard reality. You can't heal inside the system that broke you. You can't awaken while clinging to the identity you created to survive. You can't reach truth while filtering everything to the lens of, how does this make me look? The ego doesn't just hijack your life. It disguises your prison as freedom. And yet, there's something terrifyingly beautiful in all this. If the ego can hijack your life so completely without you realizing, imagine what would happen if you did realize. Imagine the power in naming the false self. Imagine the freedom in letting it die. Imagine the kind of clarity that comes not from adding more to your life, but from subtracting the lies. That realization is coming, but it won't be easy, because to kill the ego, you have to face the parts of yourself you buried, the parts that still ache, the parts that still fear, the parts that remember who you were before the world told you who to be. And the ego, it will fight back with everything it has. Because the moment you start remembering who you are, it starts dying. There is a moment, not loud, not dramatic, when the performance becomes unbearable. It might come in the middle of success, or at 3 a.m., staring into a dark ceiling you've seen too many times. Maybe after one more conversation where you laugh on cue and say what's expected, and your mouth keeps moving, but something inside you has already gone quiet. It doesn't feel like an explosion. It feels like erosion, like something once solid inside you is quietly crumbling. This is where the rebellion begins. Not with rage, not with shouting, but with radical stillness. Because the first act of defiance against the ego isn't to fight it. It's to stop performing for it. And in that silence, no applause, no spotlight, you begin to feel the first tremors of your real self. This is terrifying, because the ego, though cruel, was consistent. It gave you rules, scripts. It told you how to win. It told you who to be. But now the voice is gone. And what remains is space, emptiness, a question you've avoided your whole life. If I am not who I pretended to be, then who am I? This is the desert the mystics wrote about. This is the dark night of the soul. And yet, here, right here, is where you begin. Carl Jung understood this process well. He called it individuation, the integration of the shadow, the reclamation of the rejected self. Not the curated self, not the admired self, but the whole self. The parts that cry without reason, the parts that dream strange dreams, the parts that scare you with their depth. To break free from the ego is not to become someone else. It's to return to the person you were before you needed to be someone else. That begins with the hardest step of all, surrender. You stop defending yourself in every conversation. You let go of being right. You stop correcting people's perception of you. You allow someone to misunderstand you, and you survive it. This feels like death, but it's only death to the false self. The true self, it doesn't need protection. It doesn't need validation. It doesn't need to be the smartest, strongest, most admired person in the room. It just needs to be allowed. So, how do you begin? Start small. Start inward. Here are the rebellious acts no one will clap for, but they will save you. Feel your emotions fully without explaining them away. The ego demands you always appear composed. Defy it. Be raw. Tell the truth, especially when it costs you approval. The ego lives and lies. Starve it. Listen without preparing your next line. The ego sees silence as weakness. Learn to sit in it. Do something for no external reward. No likes, no claps, no audience. Just because your soul says yes. Look at your shadow, jealousy, anger, insecurity, and say, I see you, you're part of me, and I'm still worthy. This is where the transformation begins. Because once you stop running from your shadow, you stop being controlled by it. Viktor Frankl once wrote that freedom lies in the space between stimulus and response. In that space is your power to choose who you are. The ego reacts. The soul responds. The ego defends. The soul listens. The ego seeks power. The soul seeks truth. And once you reclaim that space, once you see that you are not your thoughts, not your fears, not your image, you become dangerous to every system that relied on your obedience. You stop buying things to prove worth. You stop chasing people to feel loved. You stop begging the world to tell you who you are. And that's when something remarkable happens. The voice inside you returns. Not the voice of the ego, not the script, but the deeper voice, the knowing. It doesn't shout. It doesn't perform. It simply says, there you are. This is the real rebellion. Not escaping society. Not burning down the world. but walking through it with stillness that cannot be influenced, a confidence that isn't loud, but unshakable. You no longer need to win every argument, because you're no longer arguing for your identity. You no longer need to impress, because you're no longer seeking rescue in other people's eyes. You no longer need to prove your worth, because you've remembered it. This doesn't mean the ego dies forever. It will return when you feel vulnerable, when you feel rejected, when the old fear of not enough resurfaces. But now you'll recognize it. You'll say, "Ah, there you are," and then you'll return to stillness, to truth, to you. This rebellion is not a moment. It's a practice. 1,000 small deaths of the false self. 1,000 small awakenings of the real. And each time you choose truth over image, depth over comfort, presence over performance, the ego weakens, and something ancient, powerful, and beautifully quiet takes its place. There comes a moment, quiet, almost imperceptible, when you realize you've stopped performing. You're not trying to impress anyone. You're not measuring your worth against the room. You're not chasing the illusion of someday I'll be enough. You are simply here, and it is enough. Not because you've achieved some mystical state of enlightenment, but because you've stopped abandoning yourself to chase someone else's reflection. This is the final realization. You were never broken. You were just buried beneath expectations, buried beneath survival strategies, buried beneath an identity built to protect you from pain, but that, in the end, caused more of it. The ego's great lie was that you had to become someone. But the truth is, you only ever had to remember who you are. This remembering isn't an intellectual process. It's not something you can read in a book or recite in a mirror. It's an undoing, a peeling away, a sacred unlearning. And as you strip away the masks one by one, what emerges is something startling in its simplicity. You, not the curated version. Not the clever, confident, high-performing version, but the real you, the one who feels deeply, the one who doesn't always know what to say, the one who craves connection more than control, the one who still believes in beauty, in stillness, in the healing power being truly seen. And here's the truth the ego could never survive. There is nothing wrong with you. Never was. You didn't need to be fixed. You needed to be freed. Freed from comparison. Freed from roles. Freed from the exhausting burden of being someone all the time. Because when the ego dies, what you're left with isn't emptiness. It's peace. The kind of peace that doesn't depend on external validation. The kind of peace that holds space for your darkness and your light, without needing to explain either. The kind of peace that allows you to walk through the world with an open heart, even when it's been broken. This is what philosophers and mystics across time have pointed to. The state beyond ego. Nietzsche called it the Übermensch, the one who creates meaning from within. Jung called it individuation, the integration of the whole self. Lao Tzu called it Wu Wei, action without force, being without striving. Jesus called it becoming like a child, undefended, pure, unmasked. They were all pointing to the same doorway, a life beyond ego, a life lived not as a performance, but as a prayer. And you don't have to become perfect to step through it. You only have to become honest. Honest about your pain. Honest about your fear. Honest about the parts of you that you've tried so hard to silence because they didn't fit the image. The final irony is this. The parts you were most ashamed of are the keys to your liberation. The softness you hid to appear strong. The tears you buried to seem put together. The insecurities you cover with success. They are not your weaknesses. They are your doorway back to your soul. Because when the mask falls, the world doesn't end. What ends is the illusion that you ever had to wear it in the first place. And from that ending, a new kind of life begins. Not easier, not prettier, but real. A life where failure becomes a teacher, not a sentence. Where connection means being seen, not being perfect. Where growth is no longer performance. It's becoming who you were always meant to be. In this life, you don't dominate others to feel powerful. You stand in your truth so deeply that others feel safe to do the same. You don't climb ladders of success to prove your worth. You plant roots in your own soul and let your life grow from there. And when the ego returns, and it will, You'll smile, not with contempt, but with compassion. You'll say, I know why you're here. You were trying to protect me, but I don't need protection anymore. I need truth. And the ego, sensing it has lost its power, will retreat, because it cannot survive in the presence of a person who has nothing to prove. So here you are, no mask, no performance, no role to maintain, just breath, just being, just you. And that is the most powerful thing in the world.